Rebuilding the L67 or any type of 3800. A lot of guys are scared to dive in and rebuild themselves, and you shouldn't unless you have access to a really good machine shop. The reason these don't stay together is because there's a lot of machine work usually required to get it back in the spec where it will stay together. One of the big problem areas with these, especially when you got high miles, is the big end of the rod. We get a lot of crank flex, and our crank is a whole lot stronger than the rod. And as we all know, the rod rides on a crank journal. That flex, a lot of times, knocks this rod out of circle. And it's actually an oval shape, and so is the rod bearing in the inside of it. It kind of reshapes the big end of that rod. What happens is when people go through these engines and try to freshen them up, they put brand new rod bearings in there, and they put perfect circle rod bearings in that rod. Well, if your rod bearings are a perfect circle and your rod's an oval, what's going to happen is the rod's going to try to reshape these bearings. And usually you'll throw a bearing because it'll try to do it immediately as soon as you start the car. The old rods that are in there already that have turned into ovals, they can stay in there and last quite a while as long as they're the same shape and they've done it gradually over time. But once you rebuild it, that's why a lot of people spin rod bearings. And a lot of folks don't know that. You got to take these rods into a machine shop and just have them check them out and make sure they're perfect circles. You know, and if they're not, you want to recondition that rod. Another thing with rod bolts, the bolts are usually not as strong as the rod itself. So when a rod does snap or fail on the big end, it's usually because it's a bolt that snapped. So people go to ARP bolts and things like that. When that happens, you definitely want to recondition the rod to fit that bolt because it's a different thread. It's very similar, but it's not the same bolt. So just something to pay attention to. What else do we got here? If you ever spin a bearing on a crank, do not reuse the crank without getting the crank grinded down and polished. 9 times out of 10, you're going to spin a bearing. Our balance isn't very good from the factory. We didn't need a good balance from the factory. That's why we get a lot of crank flex. As a matter of fact, this particular engine, these rods in here, before I got them balanced, one was 14 grams heavier than the next. That thing would have came apart on me at 6,500 RPM. That's a lot of unbalanced weight. So I had to fully balance this engine so that when I do rev really high, you know, it'll stay together and that crank won't flex. It's just like spinning a rod on your finger here. When I do this, this thing's pulling my hand all sorts of ways and it's flexing my finger. That's what the rod has to deal with at 6,500 RPM. It's a lot of pressure. But if I have another piston, what we got over here? I don't have one laying around. But if we have another piston glued to this piston going upwards, I can spin these things and it wouldn't make my hand pull my hand one way or the other, you know, and that's why it's so important to balance these things if you're going to rev them really high. So I'm done assembling the lower end. Let's go take a look at it. ARP bolts in there, it's fully balanced. All the rods reconditioned. All the rods custom fit to these bolts. We did quite a bit of work. As you can see here, some material he polished off, welded on. There used to be a hole just like that here. You know, he just put some extra weight in there and took extra weight off in certain places, and we got this thing balanced out. Yeah, well, this should be a pretty stout engine. I'm going to go ahead today. My cam just came in the mail, so I can actually start putting the cam in and finish up the lower end. But yeah, we'll finish this thing up and drop it in there. And hopefully it runs like hell. Stay tuned. Deuces.